Hello everyone, greetings to one and all. I welcome you all to my new series, Debugging. Through this series, I intend to explain both functional and the technical consultants about the basics and a deeper knowledge on the debugging concepts. In this video, I'm going to explain you the basics of debugging along with some important function keys that's used. So let's jump into the topic. What is debugging? In short, SAP has provided us a tool called Debugger through which we can inspect the coding during runtime. When I say runtime, during execution of any operation. So this process of using the debugger tool to inspect the code is called debugging. Debugging helps us in understanding the program flow. For example, a program can have thousands of code lines, of which not every code line is going to get executed when we run a particular scenario. Only based on our scenario, whichever code lines are eligible for our selection parameters, the flow that we have selected, only those code lines will get executed. So this program flow can be understood through debugging. We can view the different data objects used, like the variables that are used, the internal tables that are used. So all these things can be viewed via this debugger tool. Breakpoints are the placeholders that are used in debugging. Now, breakpoints itself is a big concept which I will explain you in my subsequent videos. For now, understand breakpoint as a placeholder which helps in debugging the program. So breakpoints can be placed only on executionable lines. I'll explain this concept as well once we get on to the hands-on part. So for today's hands-on session, the important points that we are planning to cover is the function keys F5, F6, F7, F8 that are used for our debugging process. These four function keys are very important, and because these are the four keys that we will be using throughout our debugging process. Just for the benefit of the video purpose, I will not use the function keys exactly. Rather than I will use their respective buttons that appear on the screen. Single step represents F5, execute represents F6, return represents F7, and continue represents F8. You will have a better clarity when I run through the video for the hands-on part. Now let's jump on to the hands-on. So I have explicitly created a program just for debugging purpose. So in this program, I have placed breakpoints on these line items. Now, before I get into the debugging part, I'll explain some important concepts of this program. So this program, basic intention of this program is I have created a particular field in the selection screen. So in the selection screen, I have a variable called student ID. So based on the inputs I give in the student ID field, the respective parameters will be retrieved. If I don't give an input, all the fields from the table, all the values from the table will be retrieved. If I give a wrong student ID field, the program will spit out an error that it's a wrong student ID that you have entered. Now this program has four different blocks: top, SCR, COD, and EXE. The top is where the data declarations are there. SCR is where the screen elements, like whenever I execute, the selection screen elements are declared. This code segment has all the codes inside, and there is another block called execution segment which determines the flow of the program. Now, the second concept I would like to explain is there are different blocks in this program. For instance, if you see here, line number 11, this block where it is indicated with a keyword called perform is called as a subroutine. So when I say block, it means that when you double click on this block, there are a cluster of code lines inside. Okay, so that's the reason I call it as a code block. Another form of code block is our Java concept, wherein this is a method of a local class that I have designed in the program. So if I get into this particular code, you will have different set of code lines inside that particular block. For simplicity purpose, I used a very minimum code here. In real case scenarios, you will have thousands of code inside each block. And there is another code block, which is again a subroutine, wherein I'm using it to display the data. Now inside this code block, I have another code block, which is the method that I'm used in the program, which displays the data for me. So we have two different scenarios. One is a subroutine code block, another is a method code block. And inside a one subroutine block, I have called the method block. So I have a block inside another block. So it's very important to understand this code blocks concept because the function keys plays a vital role when we execute this. You will understand why I'm explaining this code block during this debugging session. So inside this perform validate code block, each line here is an executable code line. Okay, the select statement starts here and it ends with a full stop, so this is the executable code line. The if statement starts here and ends with a full stop, so this is an executable code line. So this else is an executable code line. So every statement that starts and ends with a full stop is called as a executable code line. Whereas this class statement is not a executable code line, rather it is just a declaration code line. Okay, now I will explain you what is the difference between an executable code line and a non-executable code line. Now here, this particular class LCL student implementation is a keyword that helps the program to understand that the methods of the class is being implemented below. Similarly, here this method keyword indicates that the method is being implemented below. So this is for the system to understand what's happening once this keyword is explicitly mentioned. Now, now placing a breakpoint is two ways. One, I directly double click on any particular, for example, this 20 is the line where I want to place the breakpoint. I place the cursor there, I double click on the left pane. I will have the session breakpoint set. Now, removing also the same, double click and the session breakpoint goes. The another method is place the cursor anywhere you want, where you want to place the breakpoint, and go to more and set and delete session breakpoint. As I told you, the external breakpoint is a different concept. I'll explain the breakpoints concept in a separate video. For now, we are only dealing with the session breakpoint. Let's stick to that. So I select this option and the breakpoint gets placed. Now all these lines what I've set now, I mean what I've chose now for placing the breakpoint or executable breakpoints, executable code lines. Now for example, let me choose this line number 18. Okay, I will try to place a breakpoint for line number 18. See what happens, it will not get placed there. Rather, it chooses the closest executable line that's present and it will place a breakpoint there. Now for example, let me try to place a breakpoint at line number 19. You see, it will not place the breakpoint there at 19. Rather, it will go to the executable line, which is 20, and place the breakpoint there. Now to explain it further, let me go to the top include, which only has the declarations. When I try to place a breakpoint here by double clicking, it says the position of the breakpoint cannot be determined because none of the code lines here are executable. Similarly, the selection screen, when I try to place a breakpoint here, the same, because none of the code lines in this block are executable code lines. So that's what I meant. Breakpoints can only be placed on an executable code lines. Okay. So let me remove this breakpoints now, and let's directly jump onto the flow. So I'll remove this breakpoint as well because, for example, when I try to place a breakpoint on any of these include, for example, I place the cursor on 10 and I'm trying to place a breakpoint, it will not get placed there. Rather, it will get placed on the report line because a report is an executable code line here. So that's what I was trying to explain. Okay, now for the benefit of the session, I'm removing all the breakpoints and I'm getting into this screen where I have placed 4 different breakpoints. Each one, I mean, here I am instantiating a particular class, the local class, and this is a code block where I validate the inputs. This is a code block where I fetch the data. This is a code block where I display the data. Okay. Now, as I progress through the program, I'll explain the keys, the significance of each keys, and I will also explain you what's the performance wise how they differ between each other. Okay, so inside this perform validate, I want to explain another concept. There is a keyword called message. So internally, SAP wise, whenever there are certain SAP standard keywords like this message, they have a code block inside. Now when I double click here, I will not be able to get into this code, but during execution I will show you the codes that get executed when I execute this particular line number 13. Okay, let's not waste any further time and let's get into the code. I execute. As soon as I execute, the initial line, I'll always choose desktop 3 just for the ease purpose, a user-friendly approach purpose. I'll have an overview of this entire debugger tool in my next videos. For now, let's concentrate on the 5 keys. So here you can find the 4 keys. Sorry, 4 keys. Here you can find all the 4 keys that I was talking about. F5 for single step, F6 execute, F7 return, and F8 continue. Okay. Now, before I reach to the selection screen, I will have this event initialization getting triggered because as per events concept, there are a specific set of events that get executed chronologically. So initialization is one of them. Just because I have explicitly declared the initialization event here, that code gets triggered first. Regarding the events of this report is a different topic altogether. I will have in one of my future videos, and I will put those link in the description below. For now, let's choose to ignore this code lines, whatever getting executed in initialization, and let's proceed further. So if you see here, this is a student ID where you are expected to input. I'm inputting a different ID which is not valid, and I'm trying to explain. So I executed with an invalid student ID. If you see here, there is an yellow marker that is at line number 11, which means that the program has stopped at this particular 11th line because we have placed a breakpoint. Okay, so the reason for having a breakpoint is the program stops exactly at the places wherever the breakpoints has been placed. So that's why I told you breakpoints are the placeholders for the debugging process. So in line number 11, the program has stopped and it is waiting for our command on how to proceed further. So how we can command it? We can command it using any of these four keys. For now, I choose to use F5. What does F5 does? F5 will always pass through all the executable code lines individually. Now, I told you this is a code block. It has a few lines of code inside this. When I press F5, it gets inside, executes each code line as per the flow. Here it is moving to the else part because it is not a valid ID, so it will not go inside here. Although we don't have anything to do here, but still it will not go inside, it will go to the else part. Now it reaches here. As I told you, this message code line itself is a code block because it has several set of code lines to get executed for us to see this message. It's displaying this message for us, right? So for this to happen, it has to execute some standard code lines. That's what this message keyword does. Now if I press F5 here, you see it will get into a standard method which executes a certain code lines so that we can see the messages on the screen. Now if you see these code lines, we didn't write anywhere in the code, right? So this is a standard code. That's what I was trying to say. So I keep on pressing F5. You see it gets executed into each of the code executable code lines, and then it will come out of this block, and then it will move out and it come out of the block, and when I press F5 again, it displays that it is not a valid ID. Now I will run through the same scenario. Now instead of F5, from here, what I'm going to do, I'll press F6. So what does F6 does? It has not executed any of the code lines in between. Rather, it directly displayed the message, which means that F6 always executes the code lines with a code block in a single step. Otherwise, F5 and F6 both stepwise, they both have the same mechanism, like they execute one line at a time. But if F5 encounters a code block, it gets into the code block, execute all the code lines and moves out. Whereas F6, whenever F6 encounters a code block, it executes the code block in one step. All the codes inside that particular block will get executed in a single step and it moves out. Now I'll execute the same scenario again. Now here, instead of F6, let me press F5. Now after going inside, when I press F6, F6 and F5 behaves the same because when F6 encounters this line, it's either it is not a code block here, right? The select statement is not a code block, so F6 has nothing to do. It will still execute that particular line in a single step, just like how F5 did, and it will move on. So whenever a code line is not a code block, F5 and F6 behaves the same. See again, in this line when I press F6, it will behave the same. It will behave the same as F5 because it is not a code block. It's just a single executable code line. So F6 behaves same as F5. But now see here, this is a code block, right? As I told you, it has some code lines inbuilt. When I press F5 from here, it will execute those lines and then come out. But here, whereas when I press F6 here, it will not get into that code block of message. Rather, it executes it in a single step. So this is the prime difference between F5 and F6. Hope you understood that. Now let's execute the same scenario and I will explain what is F7. So in case of F7, during our debugging process, at many times we may enter into many code blocks where unfortunately we may get into some blocks that we are not interested to dig further. For example, this is a standard message, correct? If I press F5, I'm pressing F5 and I got into it. Now, all these code lines, there is nothing for me to investigate because it's standard code lines and they are going to just display the error message which is supposed to get displayed based upon the code. So there is no point in inspecting this tool, right? So if I wish to come out of any code block immediately without going step by step, Okay, because once I got into any particular code block, F5 and F6 both are same for me, right? F5 is also going to take one step and F6 is also going to take one step. So I cannot keep executing each lines. Just in order to save time, I have to execute everything in a single step and I want to move out of this block. That's where F7 is going to help us. When I press F7, it just moves out of that block and the control comes over to the previous code block. So now message inside the message there was a code block. Now it is moved out of that code block and it came to the validate subroutine code block, right? So from here, F5, F6, F7 all are same because in the next step immediately they are going to display the error message for us. So I press F7 and it displays the error message for us. Okay. Now I'll execute the same. Now in from this, what happens when I press F7 from here? When I press F7 from here, what happens? It completes the execution because it did not it is not inside any of the code block to come out, right? So when it is not inside any code block and when it is a part of or at the start of any code block or a part of an execution line, if it does not has to come out of a code block, or in other words it is not having any other code block outside waiting, it just executes the cycle. Like whatever code lines are there next to be executed, it executes them all. Then what does F8 does? F8, which is continue, also does the same. Okay, they complete the execution without stopping anywhere. They just complete the execution. So F5 and F6 has a similarity in moving one step whenever they execute with a single step. F7 and F8 has a similarity whenever they are not inside any block. Now I'll explain you how F8, F7, F6 are common in one terminology. Okay, F5, as you know, it just moves every line, every executable line. However, F6, F7, and F8, they have the power of jumping ahead of the code lines, right? They can move ahead of the code line. They don't have to necessarily stop on each executable line. They can execute and they can move ahead, right? But one similarity between all of them is if there are any breakpoints during their execution cycle or during their execution journey, if there are any breakpoints placed inside, they will stop there. For example, check here. Here inside this validate form, I am placing a breakpoint at line 10. Okay. Now, after I place the breakpoint, let me try to execute the same cycle again. Okay. Let's see what happens. Now I execute it. I input the wrong ID here. I execute it. Now I press F5. As per F5, it has to go through each individual step, correct? So it executes, it goes to each executable line and it completes the cycle and then it will just move ahead and it will display the error message. So that's what F5 is supposed to do for us, correct? Now, I'll execute the same cycle, but here instead of F5 from here, I will press F6, execute. What is expected to happen? This perform validate statement is supposed to get executed in a single step and the result has to display, right? But see what happens here. When I press execute, it stops again inside on the place where the breakpoint is placed. So F6 through their execution journey, if there are any breakpoints placed in between, they will stop there. Now I press F6 and I execute. See, the execution is complete. Now I'll do the same with F7. The breakpoint stops at 11. I'm pressing F7. F7 also stops in the breakpoint. Okay. Now I press F7 again. It doesn't execute any line item further. I mean, it doesn't show to us. However, it gets executed in the backend. Okay. But it doesn't, the control will not be in the debugger screen. The control will come to the next screen, what as per the execution. So if you see F7, it directly stopped in the breakpoint and showed us the result. Now I'll do the same with F8. Okay, I'm pressing continue now. F8 also stops at the breakpoint and the next press it will complete the execution. So the point I'm trying to convey here is both F6, F7, I mean all F6, F7, F8, though they have different functionalities, they always stop at the breakpoints if at all there is some placed during their execution journey. So F6, though it is expected to execute the block in a single step, if there are any breakpoint placed inside the block, they will stop there. F7, whereas it is expected to either come out of a block if it is present inside a block, or it is expected to complete the execution if it is not present inside any block. During this journey, if any breakpoints are placed, it will stop there. And similarly, F8, irrespective of whether you are inside a block or outside a block or wherever you are, F8 is expected to complete the execution. But if at all a breakpoint is placed, it will stop there. Okay. Now I'll get into a positive scenario where I don't enter any input values and I'm going to execute this. Okay. So if you see here, now this scenario, it will display all the entries of the table. I will execute using single step. Now in the single step, my if statement is successful, so it will not go to the else statement. You see, the block is completed. Now it goes to the startup selection. It is trying to fetch the data from the data fetch method. It will get into the method and it will fetch the entries. It will execute all the executable code lines inside, and it will move to the end of display. It will get into the display plot. Now the display method is triggered. It will execute all the code lines. Just to save time, let me complete the execution by pressing F8. With F8, what happens? It will just complete the execution. Correct? And just because there was no breakpoints placed, it completed the execution. Now we will rerun the same scenario. Okay, and with a different key. Now I'm executing it again. It stops here. Now instead of F5, let me place F6. What does F6 does? Just because a breakpoint was placed inside, it is going in. So I will just remove the breakpoint for now and I'll save it. Now I'll click on F7. F7 will first check whether inside a block. If it is inside a block, it will come out of the block. So yes, it has come out of the block. The next time when I press F7, if it is not inside any block, it will try to complete the execution. But what happens? Since there are breakpoints placed in between, it stops there. Okay, it stops at the breakpoints wherever it is there. So here there is a breakpoint, so it is stopping there. I press F7 again. Here there is another breakpoint, so it is stopping there. And if I get inside this block, it will execute each of the line item. From here, if I press F7, it will just display because there was no breakpoints in between and there is no next block to be executed. So it just came out of that particular block and it displayed the result for me. Now I'll execute the same using F8. Okay. Now I'll execute it. Now from this particular point, let me give F5. I got inside. From here, when I press F8, if there are no breakpoints outside, it will directly complete the execution. Okay. But just because there are some breakpoints on the outside, it is stopping there. Now what I will do, I will just remove these breakpoints. Okay. I will save it and I'll complete this execution. Now again, I'll show you the difference. Okay. Now, when I execute this, consider I'm going inside. When I press F5 and F6 here, both will do the same. F5 also will go line by line. F6 also will go line by line. Now again I press F5, it will go line by line, right? Now when I press F6 again, it will go to the next executable line. And so F5 and F6 here, once you are into a block, F5 and F6 are same. Let me complete this run. Now I'll execute the same run again. Now we will see the significance of F7 and F8. Now I'm inside F5. Okay, I'm inside this block. When I press F7, it comes out because it has other blocks to get executed. So it just comes out and waits for my command. Okay. Now again, when I press F7, it did not, it's coming out to the previous block, next block, which is the report debug block. And when I press F7 again, it executes. Okay. Now I'll do the same without pressing F7. I will do the same with F8 key. Okay. Now I'm into the block again. Now I'm not pressing F7. I'm directly pressing F8. See, it is not coming out of any block. It completes the execution for me. So that's what the F5, F6, F7 and F8 differentiates between themselves, and they have a huge significance in debugging process. So in the next coming videos, I'll explain some important concepts about breakpoints, and I'll also give an overview of this debugging tool. Thank you for the session. Thank you for watching my video. I request you to kindly subscribe for more upcoming videos on the same series, and also please follow my other series as well. If you want any of the topic to be covered, please comment with the topic so that I can cover in my subsequent videos. Thank you and see you in my next video soon.